I get it. Interest rates rising scares people. Let's face it, nobody wants to be paying more per month to own their home, especially if they've bought a property recently, because prices have been on the up, as we all know. But let's get some facts straight, because what's been really bothering me is a borderline hysteria that's been in the headlines around what's going to happen to property prices in Australia when interest rates rise. So let's just get a little bit of clarity around this. The first point of clarity is exactly how vulnerable the Australian property market is to interest rate rises. And when I say how vulnerable is it, it really comes down to how many individuals are going to be vulnerable. Now, I don't want to downplay that. For those who are vulnerable, it's awful, right? We don't like anyone under housing pressure or what they call mortgage stress. We don't want that. However, let's get some facts here. As at April 2022, the total value of property in this country was almost $10 trillion. It was actually $9.9 trillion. That's the total value of residential property in Australia. The amount of debt on that, I don't know, have a guess. Well, you'd probably be wrong, because I would have guessed higher than this. The amount of debt on that almost $10 trillion is $2 trillion. That means 20% of the total value of Australian property is owed to the banks. Now, if you think about that, that sort of messed with your head a little bit in terms of how vulnerable is the entire property market to interest rate rises. Well, obviously not that vulnerable when you think that only 20% of the total value is debt. So let's look at some more reality checks, some more data that might give us a little bit of comfort. In rough terms, around about a third of residential property in Australia is held without any debt, around a third with a moderate amount of debt, and a third with a lot of debt. So obviously that latter third are more vulnerable than the other 2/3. Let's look at some more stats. Over the period of COVID lockdowns, and also that period of time where we've had really, really super low interest rates, the banks have been saying that Australians on average have actually paid 22 months ahead on their mortgages. So that means that the average borrower is ahead on their repayments. Once again, that's not going to make them that vulnerable. If you look at the history of price rises and falls and interest rate rises and falls over the past few decades, you'll see that there's not actually a direct correlation between rising interest rates and falling prices. It's loose at best, but it's definitely not a strong correlation. Now, that's not to say the interest rate rises and falls don't play a part, but it's obvious to me that they're not the sole cause. Otherwise, that correlation would be a hell of a lot clearer. Here's another fact. Banks love to forecast what the property market's going to do. They also love to forecast what interest rates are going to do. And you know what? Bank forecasts when it comes to the property market are mostly wrong. And if you really doubt me on that one, download our full or forecaster report on the Elephant in the Room website. We do one of those every single year. And I tell you what, we've been tracking bank forecasts for some time. And honestly, the odds are that they're going to be wrong, and often a lot wrong. So not everyone is going to be vulnerable to interest rate rises. Really, the property market shouldn't fall off a cliff because rates rise. And let's face it, with every shock that the property market suffers in this country, well, we're still waiting for it to fall off a cliff and for all those doomsayers and property bears to have their predictions proven right. We're still waiting for that. So who is going to be more vulnerable to interest rate rises? Well, absolutely, there will be a section of our home owning population that will be vulnerable. And you can pretty much say that anybody who bought in the last 2 years has bought in an environment of really low interest rates. They haven't had the chance to actually squirrel away and get ahead on their mortgages in quite the same way someone who had a mortgage before the COVID boom. But if they bought at the beginning of the COVID boom, well, hey, they've had a lot of equity growth in that time, so maybe that will allow them to refinance. So really the people most at risk here are people that have bought, say within the last 2 years, they've borrowed really to the extent of their capacity, potentially if they've actually borrowed with high multiples of their earning, they've really really stretched themselves. They've bought a property that hasn't gone up in value, because that can happen in many cases, and they're sitting there thinking, ooh, I might have negative equity, I don't have a buffer, and if something should go wrong, or if interest rates go up a lot, I really am at risk of not being able to make my repayments, and I don't have a fallback position. That is ultimately quite a small percentage of our market, and I don't want to minimise the impact on those people, but it really is a small percentage. To put it in perspective, roughly 600,000 properties are sold per annum in Australia. As I mentioned earlier, the total value of property is $10 trillion. The total amount of properties is something like 10 million properties. Only 600,000 per annum tends to change hands. So if you say that over the last 2 years, that's 1.2 million properties have changed hands. So that's 1.2 million potentially vulnerable property owners. That's 12% of the market. Now, not all of those people would have borrowed to the max. Not all of those people would not have fallback positions. So my best estimate is a percentage of 12% of the total property market is vulnerable. Now, there's probably better data out there than what I've given you that could give you a clearer picture on that. But let's just get into perspective. The whole market won't fall off a cliff. There won't be a mass sale. And the only reason prices will fall is if consumers read too many of these headlines, believe them, and act on them. Now, I'm all for more truth, transparency, and trust in the property industry. And if you'd like to join the conversation, leave a comment.